Right, let's get started. So first of all, introductions. I'm Sarah Bull. I'm employment partner in the London office at Burkett's, and my co-hosts today are Charlotte Sloan, and Charlotte is a legal director in the employment team in our Sevenoaks office, and Charlotte and I cover London and the South East between us. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Yvonne Smith today. And Yvonne is the Director of Human Resources and Legal Practices at Hays. She's also, very pertinently for this, UK and Ireland lead for Hays in terms of DE&I solutions. And you may have seen articles in the media fairly recently in which Hays conducted a nationwide survey all about today's topic, different ways of working. And Yvonne has agreed to very kindly take part in today's session to give us a bit of information about the findings of that survey. So over to you, Yvonne.
Thanks, Sarah. Really delighted to be here today. Here we are. I have flipped the title around the other way, so flexibility versus productivity, because as Sarah said, what I'm talking about today is really just giving you a little bit of an overview on some of the findings and the preferences and the sentiment that we surveyed on in the kind of late, I would say early summer, over summer. And the majority of what I want to talk about is looking at preferred working practices at that time. There's been a little bit of a shift, so I'll update on that. But also we are in the process of just launching our UK salary guide here at Hays through a series of events across the month of November, where we also have a look at kind of market narrative, preferences, etc. So I'm kind of feeding them all into one. But the majority of my reference points, if you like, are anchored on this What Workers Want series of reports that we produced. And from a talent perspective, which is kind of like the worker, as far as Hays customer relationship is concerned, it's the flexibility, which is very much the kind of the driving preference. So I flipped it to flexibility versus productivity. And basically the kind of the what, where and when. So I'll just share a little bit of that with you. I'm happy to take questions at the end, but I think it will be a good jump off point for some of the points that both Sarah and Charlotte will be talking about when the Burkett section comes on. So let's move on, shall we, into our first slide. So some of the points I'll be talking about and some of the themes are what's the current state when we're looking at kind of frankly hybrid working, and I'll focus primarily on hybrid working. How do employees, the workers, want to work? Do employers know how your staff prefer to work? Is there consultation around that? How to effectively support a split workforce, a hybrid workforce, quite challenging for managers. Looking at some of the real touch points where there is room for improvement. So things like the blurring of, when a meeting's being held and when you're on and when you're off. So I'll touch on that. How to encourage staff back into the workforce. That's certainly a shift we're seeing, post-survey as we've kind of gone into the late summer and early autumn. And then just some key takeaways, things to take away. So that's really what I'll be covering off pretty briefly. So let's keep moving. So by way of scene sets, what percentage of the UK is hybrid working at the moment? Well, we have about 44% of individuals who have some element of remote working in their working pattern at the moment. There are actually less than 1 in 5 individuals who are working either exclusively in the office or exclusively out of the office in terms of their preferred way of working. The majority are working in some kind of hybrid way, and certainly that is the preference for the majority of workers. You won't be surprised to hear that it's very much dependent on roles. So office-based roles, white-collar, knowledge-based professional roles tend to be much more kind of hybrid orientated, and then on-site roles, obviously much more site-based. And that's creating, and I'm sure we'll touch on this, that's creating a little bit of a them and us when we're looking at different working populations. And what does that mean when you're looking to accommodate the integration of professional and personal life and responsibilities and duties and desires, which was very much brought to the fore and still remains so, both as a result of the pandemic, but also when we look at intergenerational working as well. So let's just move to the next slide. So this is a little bit of a busy slide, and so I'm not going to go over all these points, but I just wanted to kind of capture some data points for you and quickly kind of talk you through them. I've got a few more that I'll add in, and I'll actually send you an even more detailed slide as part of the takeaway, which has just got some more data points on it. But just from what you see at the moment, let me just direct you to the bottom right-hand side first of all. So we have about 61% of employers who are offering some kind of hybrid working pattern, where they can, and professionals really feel this that it's a real driver for them, to the point that 52% of the people we surveyed, and it was about 9,000, said that they would actually move role for a more personalised, tailored, flexible working pattern. So not a one-size-fits-all, but something that suited them, and whereby there was an opportunity to review it on a fairly regular basis. So quite a high motivator, for people to potentially move. You'll see on the bottom right there are a couple of kind of 40-something percentages, and I'm just going to give a little bit more explanation on this. So overall, 43% of professionals said that they felt they were more productive, to the point of the webinar today. They felt they were more productive in the workplace. But there is some differential here in terms of certainly generational profiles here. So we found that the lower the age, so for example, sub-30s, felt they were much more productive in the workplace, whereas older workers, so those that had more experience under their belt, felt that they were more productive at home. So whilst there is a number, and I'll share these stats with you afterwards, there are some differentials there. And then overall, 41% of all professionals we surveyed, different levels of experience, etc., they felt they were more productive at home. But again, if we look at that in a bit more detail, those with managerial responsibilities, 51% of those felt that they were more productive working at home, and actually sub 30% of under 30s felt that they were more productive at home. So the number tells you one thing, but there's quite a lot of difference. And again, I'll share that with you after this webinar. Just in terms of some of the other data points on here, we had a look at the kind of size of organisations that people were working in. And again, preferences, it was all about what workers want. So 30%, 29% of SME employees preferred to work in a workplace, compared to 18% of individuals who were working in large organisations. So again, that could be to do with resources, demographics, social interactions, other resources that are made available to you in larger organisations, perhaps less of a sense of isolation. And then again, in the little blue box there on the left-hand side of your screen, again, from an age preference, 64% of sub-30-year-olds said they would prefer to work in a hybrid way, compared to actually just over 50% of individuals who are over the age of 50. Some examples there of what would tempt people to move jobs. I've already mentioned actually tailored hybrid working. There was quite a lot of chat about the 4-day working week, obviously 100% pay, and then just the usual flexible working arrangements that you would expect to see, that if they weren't present, or if there wasn't an opportunity to consult with those in an existing role, they would be likely to move. And is it a one-size-fits-all? Is there an element of tailoring? Again, broadly split in terms of, if you like, kind of formal and informal consultations that go on, and whether you have that opportunity to discuss your personal needs and if they're being met. Again, 83% and 63% there on the kind of bottom left-hand side, where 83% of employees felt it was important to capture the working arrangement within a formal contract, whereas 63% said that it wasn't really included in their contract. So again, it's just recognising that these things should have some element of assurity and security around them if the arrangements are being made. Let's just go to the next slide. So doing a little bit of a kind of a deeper dive on this, do employers know how their staff prefer to work? So this again is just asking, are you being spoken to about this stuff? Are you being told what to do? Is there a level of consultation? And again, just the kind of main takeaways on this, it's really important that you have those consultations from a retention perspective, because people do have, whilst the recruiting market, the staffing market has kind of, some of the heat's been taken out of it, there is still, a real demand for skills and a bit of a war for talent, in the UK has been for a while, certainly for high in demand skills and individuals, and people can walk into new roles at the moment. So from a retention perspective, asking for feedback from your employees on their preferred ways of working, ideally more than just once a year. So a regular, check in on that is going to be very, very important for them to stay engaged in your organisation. And then there's a sense of actually, is action being taken once, we kind of share our thoughts and ideas, not just on the working pattern, but more broadly. And again, you'll see that there's kind of like, yes, actions being taken 49% sometimes, and only very few are saying 11% saying, actions never taken. And again, just structurally, we find that in smaller organisations, there seems to be less consultation than in larger organisations. So again, we need to be talking more to our people if we want to keep them, really, to recognise their circumstances and their situation. It's a very, very high priority on the part of workers. Let's go to the next slide. So how to support them? Again, there are some data points here around what workers are saying that they want when it comes to hybrid and working, and really being the very best they can be and fulfilling their potential, and then the support that's being offered by employers. So again, where's the alignment? And I'm just going to draw your attention to 3 stats here where the difference is kind of 10%, more than 10%. So from a mental health at the middle there, from a mental health and well-being perspective, a lot of employers are offering that. 64% have absolutely stepped up to the mark and are saying, yeah, we're doing this. It's really important, particularly, as I say, post-pandemic, and just a recognition that well-being is just so important. But actually, only 49% of employees were saying that actually, we feel like we really need that. So maybe employers at the moment are kind of overcompensating on the health and kind of well-being type conversations. Flipping it back the other way, where there's a need and a demand on the part of employees, but there's a deficit on the part of employers. The first line there, the first bar graph, employees at the moment, workers, they want very clear training and development opportunities for all sorts of different reasons. Fast-moving world of work, implementation of AI, technology tools, etc., staying relevant. And again, so 64% say that's really important to me, particularly in this kind of hybrid world. But only kind of 53% of employers are kind of stepping up to the mark there. So there's a deficit there in terms of expectation and perhaps supply on the part of employee and employer. And I'll take you to the bottom bar there, the bottom line. And this is something we'll explore in just a moment, reducing the number of online meetings. So that kind of blurring of professional, personal, burnout, I'm always on, when am I off, etc. So, 19% of the people we surveyed said, I absolutely want less online meetings, but only 9% of employers are actually responding to that and saying, yes, I'm doing something about that, and I'm taking action to really have a look at that part of our practice and the way in which we manage our people. So those are just where we had some real kind of light and shade, if you like, in terms of findings. If we move to the next slide. So if we just have a look at meeting restrictions, this is how do you do it? And I would suggest that this is a really quick win. Now, clearly, it does actually link to well-being and areas of productivity and burnout and retention, etc. So lots and lots of good things could be secured by employers if they just looked at this one aspect of the way in which they are managing their people and expecting people to respond. So again, quite a lot of information here, hopefully, that you can do something with. So perceived benefit to the part of, the employee, thinking about, when the meetings are being held, the duration of the meetings, not having recurring meetings, and just having meeting-free days. Really important to think about how the time is being managed. And of course, this is a real problem for managers who are managing hybrid teams. This is a huge shift, and it's really, really challenging for them, moving from a largely presenteeism, I can see my people, I can, work with them in that way, to actually trying to cover what's a pretty kind of, dynamic workforce. But just a couple of thoughts there about what's important to employees and the degree to which employers are implementing those. So just a couple of quick wins there, hopefully. If we just move to the next slide. Encouraging staff back to the workplace. So again, we surveyed on actually what would motivate you to come back. And again, this is very much kind of heightened, certainly post-summer, where we're seeing, increasing numbers of organisations saying that we really want our people back. And people saying, yeah, but I don't really want to come back. And what's the balance? So on the left-hand side, we would put out there, some of the incentives that we were seeing in play. To what degree were employees interested? As a general rule, there is a cost basis to quite a lot of the things that are incentivised, and they are probably of most interest to under 30s, so to your more junior levels in your organisation. So it's talking to a certain group. Interestingly, 12% of employees said that nothing would tempt them to come back overall, to come spend more time back in the workplace. Clearly, we're talking about the carrot there, and there isn't the stick. But again, as a general rule, for the older someone got in terms of their age profile, the less inclined they were to shift the way in which they had sorted their life in terms of coming back to the workplace. And also, I think that's also linked to social interactions, learning and development, and kind of what you get from your workplace in those earlier years. So again, just a bit more information behind the stats there, which again, I'm happy to share this report with everybody. There's a lot more detail in there. So just finally, in terms of kind of some key takeaways and really just some questions that maybe we can just change the slide. So just a few things to think about for employers, for this audience, but also the kind of conversations that we're having with employees when we're saying, look, are you getting what you need from your organisation? So kind of like loops back to the questions I posed at the beginning and some of the themes, and then some of the data that I've shared in this report. So there's lots of data, lots of analysis, lots of narrative. Very happy to share the report with anyone who would like to see that. But that's just an overview and in terms of a scene set. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. That's really useful. And I think it shows how much of a live issue this is, and a fast evolving issue. I think if you did that study next year, things will have moved on it again. And I like the fact you flipped the title to flexibility versus productivity. And one of the things we're going to look at a little bit later, Charlotte's going to look at, is whether that's even a fair title, and what is the data around productivity and hybrid working. So I'm just going to have a quick look now at continuing with some of the theme of the trends, and then we're going to have a quick look at the law and policies. And if we skip through some of the slides quite quickly, don't worry, we're going to send them out to you after the webinar. So as Yvonne has already mentioned, these are the key ways that people are looking to work. Next slide, please. And before just looking at how this has evolved in recent years. So before the pandemic, 12% of the UK workforce were working at home at least one day a week. And then obviously during the peak, that rose to 49%. And it settled at the beginning of this year around 44%. But since then, there's obviously been a lot in the press about individuals being encouraged to get back into the workplace. Next slide. And so just looking at the characteristics of some of these people working from home, and I think there's quite a big distinction between adults overall and then looking at young workers. As you can see on this set of slides, the vast majority of young workers are back in the workplace. Moving on. And then is there a difference between the genders? And actually, this slide shows that the ONS statistics say actually very, very little difference between men and women and who's working on a hybrid pattern. And moving on. And then what about regional differences? So you'll see from this that London is by far the capital of home and hybrid working. 69% are able to work from home to some degree. East of England, southeast, are reasonably high, with the rest of England somewhat lagging behind in terms of flexibility. And then there is a difference, as you might expect, between private and public sector, with a bit less flexibility in the private sector. Moving on. And then how do we compare to other countries? And these are the average days per week work remotely. And this was a study taken earlier this year. And looking at this, you'll see that English-speaking countries, pretty high averages. USA, UK, 1.5 days a week. And then moving to Germany and Netherlands, 1 day a week, and France and various other countries in Europe at 0.6 days a week. So actually, we are far more flexibility than many of our near relations. Next slide, please. And how do employers view the return to office? And this was a poll that was taken just a couple of months ago on CEOs, and 64% at that time said that they expected a full return to the office in 3 years' time, which I think it seems unlikely. And 87% said they, and I think this is the most striking statistic, said they are likely to reward employees who make an effort to come into the office with favourable assignments, pay raises and promotions. And I think that's something that Charlotte's going to speak to a little bit more further on, but that is pretty significant statistic. Moving on. And then, of course, there's differences between the sectors. So a couple of quotes from the technology sector here. First from James Dyson, very anti-flexible working, thinks it's deeply inefficient. And then, of course, Elon Musk, who overnight changed the Twitter policy, or X as it's now known, so that remote work is no longer allowed unless you've got a specific exemption. And moving on. And then in the financial sector, we have James Solomon, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who was very vocal about remote working and it not being a new normal throughout the pandemic. And a memo to JP Morgan employees saying they better get back into the office, otherwise they might face corrective action. And moving over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, there is a bit of a difference between different sectors, different employers as to what's going to work for you. We're hearing quite a lot about the 4-day week as well. Yvonne alluded to that fact that employees are increasingly interested in, when they're thinking about moving to a new role, is 4-day week available? Is it something that's available? If so, it might tempt them to move to that new position, that new company. So it's worth thinking about whether it's something you could accommodate or whether you want to accommodate it. So if we go on to the next slide, please. There was a national trial that happened in 2022 where various companies across various sectors participated in a pilot to see if the 4-day week would work for them. And a lot of them were paired with other organisations who were already doing a 4-day week to see how they could help them in setting that all up. It came from various other countries who have implemented 4-day weeks, Iceland being quite notable in that regard, who've successfully implemented 4-day weeks across different organisations and reported a lot of benefits, including increased productivity. So the idea of the 4-day week is essentially 100% pay, but on less hours, but with a view that people are perhaps more effective, more productive, even though they're working less hours. Therefore, it doesn't justify the decrease in salary. And obviously positive benefits in terms of employees having extra day off, essentially, reporting for their well-being purposes, that helps them and makes the employer more attractive as an employer of choice. And there's various ways you can do it. So 4-day week is probably the most talked about one, being sort of 4 days rather than 5 days a week. Alternatively, 9-day fortnights are quite common as well as another, as perhaps more flexible or more possible alternative that employers may be more able to implement. There's also things like reduced hours. So rather than doing the 35 hours per week, reducing the hours down to say 30 or whatever is possible. Let me move on to the next slide. So those that participated in the trial, a lot of them continued with the trial after the trial period, needing more time to assess how it was working. We've got in here quite a high percentage that continued with the trial period. It doesn't necessarily mean that they then stuck to the 4-day week after the trial. And I think a lot of people did then reassess things and perhaps tweak them to make it more possible or more workable for their organisation. But some were able to continue with the 4-day week after the end of the trial. We move on to the next slide, please. And then the results of the trial are quite interesting, I think. We've got a high percentage of employees reporting a decrease in stress. And there's perhaps something in that perhaps less stressed employees are better, more productive employees. There's also a report of resignations down for 50%, 57%, and absenteeism also down. So that's quite a startling statistic. And again, if it's something you can implement, it may be worth considering given those very positive statistics in that regard. I guess you've got to take those statistics with a bit of a pinch of salt. Is there more to that? But certainly with organisations that I've spoken to, I've worked with, who have been able to implement some kind of 4-day week or some variation of it, they've essentially got very positive buy-in from the employees that they're into what they're offering, saying, yes, we want this to work, we're going to make it work. So I think probably having that real determination for the employees to make it work might contribute to those statistics with regard to resignations being down, absenteeism being down as well. So worth considering, but it's not going to be right for all organisations. I think there was a council that tried to implement 4-day weeks, which was then quite quickly told by the government, no, you can't do that. It's not good use of public sector money. So it's obviously got to be right for the organisation. That said, I have heard of colleges who have tried or at least trialled 4-day weeks. So it can perhaps work in more unusual circumstances and may have results of those positive, may have those positive benefits we talked about already. We move on to the next slide. We can talk some more about the pros and cons of a hybrid approach. So as Yvonne's already said, and Sarah's also said in the statistics, there is increased demand, certainly from employees who are looking for more of that hybrid approach, and ultimately some benefits from offering that. Recruitment and retention, again, as we've already heard from Yvonne, is probably one of the biggest things. Certainly employees are perhaps voting with their feet in terms of wanting flexibility. I'm sure many of you haven't attended an interview where somebody hasn't asked about the hybrid working policy. That is pretty much a standard question you can expect when you're interviewing staff nowadays. So if you can implement some kind of flexibility, some kind of hybrid working, and it doesn't have to be total flexibility, maybe there's parameters around that. I think if you can offer something, however, I think it can be an attraction in terms of recruitment and retention. So move on to the next slide. I'm not going to go through all the statistics there, but I think they speak for themselves. We're also hearing again that it's one of the factors that people are looking at when they're considering moving to a new job. Flexibility, hybrid working, home working are quite high up on the list. They're not the highest. I think things like pay and benefits are still sort of peaking the sort of the chart there, but it's certainly something people are increasingly interested in. So think about what you're offering and can you offer something to make sure you stand out as that employer of choice. We move on to the next slide, please. Another consideration, we talked about how everyone's switched around the productivity versus the flexibility. So going back to that productivity, is there evidence that offering that flexibility, that hybrid approach, is going to help with increasing productivity? Now, interestingly, when there's loads of surveys out there where employees are being asked about whether hybrid working, flexibility is going to make them more productive, and perhaps not surprisingly, the employees are reporting, yes, allowing me that flexibility is going to make me more productive. But does that reflect the reality is the question? And I'm going to go on to some of the more empirical evidence in relation to that. And I think it's fair to say, again, it's quite difficult to evidence to what extent hybrid working flexibility is really making the difference in terms of productivity. There's various studies out there about employees' happiness, and there's a study which involved BT call centre employees, which is this next one on the slide, which was looking at the happiness of employees, and it ultimately showed more happy employees were more productive. They sold more whatever they were selling. But does that mean potentially that people who've got that flexibility because they're wanting it are happier, therefore maybe productive? I guess there may be some link there, but it's again very difficult to show there's actual evidence to support that suggestion, but there may be something in that. We move on to the next slide. Interestingly, Facebook carried out a survey as well, and this was a survey of staff, of engineers, software engineers, to see, based on statistics of how they were carrying out their duties, how they were performing, was it better for staff to be in the office, or was it better for them to be hybrid or working from home? And this is what they found. So they said, our early analysis of performance data suggests that engineers who either joined Meta in person and then transferred to remote, or remained in person, performed better on average than people who joined remotely. And this analysis also shows that engineers earlier in their career perform better on average when they work in person. So that's quite interesting in terms of perhaps those who are new to an organisation definitely perform better potentially when they are within the organisation. And that may be an argument perhaps for things like requiring people in the office during probationary periods, or at least initially when they're settling into the role, to help them adjust to the culture of the organisation, how they need to perform within it, and also to get that sort of network. So I think that's quite an interesting survey that's been carried out. We move on to the next one. We've got another survey here from Microsoft in relation to its employees. And this, again, talks about that sort of self-reporting data versus the evidence to support that. So here, when they carried out surveys, they found that employees felt that they were able to hunker down and get less distracted while working remotely. And they enjoyed not being able to, the commute, no commute, and dressing casually, doing home chores, putting on the washing. However, they also found, to counter that, there wasn't actually a real difference between productivity levels from those working from home and those working in the office. However, they also found that actually there was a loss of that sense of purpose. So those people who were working on a hybrid working from home basis perhaps didn't have the same sense of purpose that those working in the office on a more regular basis had. So I think that is really important. So if you want people to really get engaged in the culture and the sort of drive of the business, perhaps there is an argument for being in the office a bit more over being more of a hybrid working from home employee. We move on to the next slide. I should just say, if you've got any questions as we go along, please do post them in the chat. If we don't get to answer them during the session, we will come back to you. You just leave your contact details. Only those of us who are presenting can see your contact details, but we'll promise to get back to you if you haven't had an answer to your question during the session, but we'll do our best to answer it as we go along. I mean, culture is another issue which comes up when we're talking about hybrid working, particularly where you've got a situation where you have some employees who are working in a hybrid way, working from home, versus others that are not doing that. So I think that is an important consideration. If you are having that sort of them and us culture, how do you get around it is something you really need to consider. There is certainly an argument that for collaboration purposes, it is perhaps better to be in the office, and employees themselves, this survey is saying again, report that actually they see a benefit of being in the office for collaboration purposes. We've got this nice quote on the screen here about not everybody believing in magical hallway conversations, but there is no question that working together in the same room makes a positive difference. So for innovation purposes and for those kind of collaboration conversations, I think it is important that you do see this possibility that you can have employees together in the office. A lot of organisations are going along the lines of having sort of set days when they might have team meetings or team collaborations to drive that. And I think from my own personal experience, I think I'm always enjoy being in the office when it's busier and when there's people there, and actually I can have those useful conversations versus actually just going in the office and there's not really been anyone around. So I think having those kind of set days for teamwork and for collaboration is a really good idea. I've got some other thoughts on that, which I'll come on to in one of the next slides. We move on to the next slide, please. So there's various pros and cons of hybrid working. I think we talked about employee happiness might be a driver for hybrid working, well-being, reduced stress levels, recruitment and retention arguments with allowing some kind of flexibility. Potentially it might reduce your office overheads. We've also got these arguments about potentially some increase in productivity if you've got happier employees, but again, the statistics are not always particularly clear in that regard, and also there's some arguments that they work the other way around. Overall, I think it's fair to say there isn't a one-size-fits-all position on this, and you've got to do what is right for your organisation. So rather than just saying, well, we're going to offer this because that's what everybody's doing, I think you've got to think about a tailored approach, a bespoke approach to what your employees want and what is going to make your business successful. So I think getting those views is really important, and Yvonne's already alluded to the fact that people are not necessarily looking for, you know, this particular unicorn of hybrid working. They're looking for a tailored approach that suits their needs. So I think getting those matches right is really important. We move on to the next slide. Gathering data as part and parcel of that is going to be really, really important. So not just relying on surveys from staff, although that is an important consideration. Looking at sort of statistics on actually what's the difference when people have been working more hybrid or when people are in the office, is there a distinction there? And what is going to make sure that we are all performing and collaborating and being innovative to the extent that we need to do so for our business, and then adapting your approach on that basis. We go on to the next slide. We are certainly hearing, though, that lots of businesses are increasingly wanting people back into the office. Whilst they're still committed to offering some kind of flexibility, I think we're quite a long way off any indication that we're going to go back to the 5 days fully in the office for most organisations. There is certainly a driver to get people in the office a bit more. Various reasons for that, but also various approaches as to how to do that. There's obviously the stick approaches versus the carrot approaches. And I think it's really fair to say that if you can offer the carrot more than the stick, you're probably going to benefit longer term in a more positive way. So think about the carrot if you can. And here's some examples. Again, not all of these are going to be right for your business, for your organisation, but they might give you some food for thought. So we start off in-office dining, something that JP Morgan and Disney are offering. Burkitt's actually have in one of our Chelmsford offices, we have an in-house chef. And I know that for those people in that office, it's a bit of a driver. They like going into the office to get a nice lunch from the chef. So I can see that being a benefit. Again, not something that all organisations can offer, but if you can offer something along those lines, it may be a good, positive thing. Don't just offer bananas there and fruit. I think you've got to go beyond just a bit of free fruit for staff to get them back in the office potentially. So I know lots of organisations think that might be the draw, but I think probably an overripe banana isn't going to do it. Another thing that we've heard about is, so Salesforce did a daily donation to charity for a certain period, I think it's for a month period, people who were coming into the office. So it may be you can use some of those ESG sort of initiatives, ideas. You're going to donate to charity, people who come in and participate, and you can link it to some kind of, I don't know, charity fundraising event that you're doing. So perhaps you might do a bake-off on that day or something along those lines to get people back into the office to sort of share and create that kind of sense of community back in the office. Again, I don't think many organisations will be able to do this, but Google apparently offered a Lizo concert as part of a campaign to get people back in the office, as the initial sort of we're all back now. I think even changed some of the lyrics to songs to talk about how great it was all for us to be back in the office. Probably many of you can't go that far, but can you think about anything on a more social basis which could get people more driven to return to the office? I spoke to an organisation fairly recently who were saying that they carry out pulse surveys of staff to find out what common interests staff have between them. And off the back of that, they come up with ideas for socials to fit the interests with the interests of their employees. I think that's a really good idea. If you're offering some kind of social, it's got to be something that staff want to be turning up for, not just anything. So rather than just coming up with ideas, which might be, I don't know, cupcake making or wine tasting, think about to what extent employees are going to be driven to come in for those events, and see if you can align it more closely to those common interests that people have. And if you can then perhaps also link it to something that's beneficial to the business, that would be great as well. We talked about set team days for in-house, for in-person sort of collaboration, and that's really important. It can be a good way of getting people to driven back into the office. Certainly can also create a bit of a peer pressure as well, I suppose. I'm thinking about the stick rather than the carrot, but actually lots of people are in the office and you're not. You may be thinking, actually, I should really go in. The cost of living crisis is ongoing, as we know, so maybe people are more tempted to go back into the office as it gets colder in the winter months, just to make use of the heating and that sort of thing. You've got to sort of balance that against people paying for a commute. I think people have got increasingly used to not having to pay the extortionate costs of commuting. So can you do something more creative in that regard to encourage people? So can you say, well, actually, it's okay to travel off peak, so you're perhaps coming into the office a bit later and staying on a bit later to avoid some of those commuting costs, but you can obviously benefit for other positive things of being in the office. And the final thing, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but as we know, everybody's got a dog since lockdown, or so my children tell me, we're one of the only ones. But if you can offer something like, I think it is a genuine consideration. Some people who have got to balance looking after the dog, doggy daycare versus going into the office. If you can potentially offer dogs in the office, that may be something that draws people back in. I have heard of organisations thinking about that on perhaps certain days, perhaps on a Friday when it tends to be a bit quieter. Again, not possible for all organisations, but it may be something that you can accommodate quite easily, and it can be potentially that pull back into the office. As for employment lawyers, we'd always say have a policy if you're implementing any of these kind of ideas, but just things to think about. I'm just going to contrast that against some of the sticks which other organisations are using to draw people back into the office. So we've got mandates to come back in the office on certain days from Amazon, Apple, Starbucks and Zoom. We've got warning emails from Amazon where people are not complying with requirements to come back in the office on certain days. They are getting a warning, sort of disciplinary approach. Again, whether that's going to have the positive impact long term is pretty questionable, but something you could potentially consider. We are also hearing about organisations who are linking salary increases, bonuses, promotion to being in the office, to having that presence. Again, you've got to be a bit careful with that, but it is something some organisations are doing. We've even had Stevenson and Harwood, who came up quite early after the pandemic and said, you can work remotely if you want, but if you're going to do that, you're going to take a 20% pay cut, otherwise you need to be back in the office. So those kind of things may, whilst it's more of the stick approach, could potentially draw people back into the office if that's the approach that you are desiring. And I guess we're in a climate at the moment where there's lots of redundancies happening, and people might sort of feel that pressure to potentially be more present, more visible in the workplace by actually being in the office to make sure they're not potentially at risk of redundancy. So I'm not advising you have any policy that says if you're not in the office, you're going to be at risk of redundancy. But I think that is potentially something which might be starting to sort of change people's approach to sort of going into the office a bit more. We move on to the next slide, please. I think I'm going to hand over to Sarah to talk a bit more about some of the law and some of the legal issues, and I'll pick up a bit some more on some of those as well.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yes, we were talking yesterday about dog-friendly offices, but cat-friendly homes. And whilst you were speaking, my cat came over to say hello, just to make that point. So I'm going to have a quick look at the right to request flexible working. And I think most of you will be really familiar with this right, which has, of course, been around for quite a long time now, almost 10 years. And this is, as you know, only a right to request flexible working, not a right to work flexibly. And there's a threshold for this. You need to have 26 weeks continuous service in order to make a request. And this means, as employers, you've got a bit of flexibility in terms of you can at least get through the probationary period on a working pattern that you've set out in the contract before you get to the point where you might receive a flexible working request. And if your employee does make a request to work flexibly, then you've got 3 months to consult the employee and make a decision. I mean, in my experience, most employers want to get it done as quickly as possible. Often it's being done just before the return of maternity leave, or other times where you actually sort of need to reach a resolution pretty quickly to know what working pattern your employee is going to be working. And the requirements at the moment are that you must make a decision and you must follow the process in a reasonable manner. And you can only refuse the request for one of 8 statutory reasons. And those are things like inability to meet customer demand or rearrange the workload between other people, a reduction in quality and productivity and so forth. So there's 8 different statutory reasons, and I suspect that most of you will have a policy in place that will set out those statutory reasons. There's also an ACAS code of practice on handling those requests, which is a very sort of basic and practical guide to doing so. Moving to next slide, please. Now, this law that we're all very familiar with is due to change next year. And these changes were announced this year by the government with quite a fanfare, saying that this is going to revolutionise the workplace for many people. But I think that's probably overstating it a little bit. They're more tweaking around the edges. So the significant changes are going to be you can now make 2 requests per year instead of 1, or you will be able to when the law comes in. So that's obviously increasing the administrative burden for employers, and that's something you would need to amend in your policy. You've now got 2 months instead of 3 months to make a decision. Like I've said before, most employers, I think, are keen to make the decision even faster than that to ensure that everyone has some certainty. And there's no need for the employee to explain the effect on the employer. So at the moment, when an employee submits a flexible working request, they have to set out information about not only what the change they want, but whether they think that could be in any way detrimental and how they might, as the employer, make changes to reduce the negative impact. I've always found that quite a difficult aspect of the legislation to grasp, because I think most employees struggle to look at the issue through the eyes of the employer and really assess the sort of advantages and disadvantages of the request that they're changing. You must consult, so you can't simply refuse, even for one of the reasons, statutory reasons. There must be some form of consultation. And although it's not in this specific piece of legislation that's referenced above, the government is saying that they intend to bring in further legislation to make this a day 1 right. So an employee could start with you on the Monday, and on a Monday or the Tuesday request a request for flexible working. So that's quite a significant difference as well. We don't know exactly when these regulations and these amendments are going to come into force. We think it's going to be around the middle of 2024. And moving on. So what are the possible issues that can arise if you refuse a request for flexible working? Well, there's very limited compensation and very limited recourse under the flexible working regulations themselves. Those are really about process, about making sure you followed the right procedure. But the claim that's often brought alongside one of a failure to follow the regulations is a claim for unlawful discrimination. And this often arises in the context of indirect sex discrimination, where an employee argues that there is a requirement to not work flexibly, and that requirement it affects them as a woman. And this often arises due to the fact that women are still seen as having the burden of the caring responsibilities in the home. And there's other ways in which it could amount to unlawful discrimination, although much less common. It could be a failure to make reasonable adjustments, and it could also be a breach of the religion and belief discrimination. And what you need to look at is, have you made a business decision taking into account all factors? Have you thought through your business decision? Can you justify it? Or has it just simply been a kind of knee-jerk reaction to, this is what we want our employees to do, and therefore we're going to require them to do it, and we're going to refuse the flexible working request? Of course, when you make when a claim is made for discrimination, if you lose it, then there is no cap on the discrimination, on the compensation that a claimant can win if they succeed in their claim. And moving back to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Sarah. And sort of flexible working requests can be one way of dealing with your hybrid working, home working policy, in that you just deal with it on a case-by-case basis as people put in those requests, but it's probably not the most usual or proactive way of going about things. And more commonly, organisations are putting in place some kind of policy or contractual provision. I think probably policy tends to be the preference for most organisations. And I think if you want that flexibility to perhaps change and adapt what you're doing as the world changes and adapts, having a policy is a better approach. You've obviously got to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, in that if you have a policy for a long period of time, that does that arguably create a bit of a contractual entitlement, possibly? And would it therefore, be advisable to consult if you're thinking about changing that policy, perhaps? So you've got to take it with that word of caution, perhaps get some legal advice if you are changing something dramatically from what you've been doing for the past few years. But certainly having a policy in place dealing with how you permit some kind of hybrid flexible working can be a really good idea, and it's something that you can then obviously proactively, positively talk about when it comes to recruiting people, as opposed to saying we've got some kind of discretionary option but we're not very clear and perhaps it works in different ways. So I think having some consistency can be a good thing. Not possible for all organisations, and we have seen there are some organisations who do the opposite and perhaps do more of that discretionary. It depends. We do offer something. It tends to be along these lines, which arguably might give you more scope to change things if actually, again, you need to change things going forward, but perhaps may not be seen quite as positively by your staff members, may create some inconsistency potentially. And may also sort of create those issues with regard to just people not knowing where they stand with it. So think about having a policy if you possibly can. If you haven't got one and want help with a starting point, we can help with that. Before I wrap up, I was just going to touch upon briefly some other legal issues that can arise that you need to think about if you are allowing remote working. There's quite a lot to touch upon here, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail on it, but I just wanted to highlight those matters for you. We are going to be posting, if any of you got to drop off early, we're going to be posting a survey very shortly as well. So as you leave the session, there's a survey to complete just to give us your feedback. We'd really appreciate you giving us our feedback. Largely, we want to hear from you as to what topics you're interested in for a future session and what time might work for you for another webinar. And we're keen to roll out another webinar perhaps early in the new year, but we'd like to know what you want to hear about, and we'll kind of tailor it on that basis. So please do complete that survey if you wouldn't mind. So if you are allowing some kind of remote working, things to think about are confidentiality, data security. How are you going to manage that? Make sure it's dealt with clearly in your policies, potentially in your contracts. Health and safety risk assessments for those that are home working are required. There's sort of additional requirements in that regard that need to be complied with. Many of you would have dealt with that during COVID, but it's still things you need to think about if you're allowing that on a more permanent basis. In fact, there are additional requirements there. You might need to think about sickness absence reporting. Is there going to be differences if people are working remotely? How are you going to manage that and make sure people are reporting in their sickness absence? You also need to think about things like equipment. So how are you going to be dealing with who pays for equipment for working from home? Who covers the cost if it's damaged, etc.? How is the insurance going to work in respect of that? So all those things need to be considered, and it can be dealt with in a policy, potentially, also potentially in the contract, depending on your approach. Particularly in organisations where there's a mixture of in-workplace, in-office working and home working, thinking about supervision, management, making sure people don't feel there's a them and us culture is really important. Quite difficult to get right, but also worth considering. There's lots in that, which again, if we had the time, we could go into in a lot more detail. We've talked about well-being and culture being important for hybrid workers. There's a lot in the press about burnout and how perhaps blurring the lines between home working and being working in the office is perhaps changing that and increasing sort of people feeling burnt out. So think about that as well. There's a whole heap of issues in connection with working abroad. For those of you who do permit people to work abroad in some form or another, that's something, again, we could touch upon in another webinar if that's of interest. And finally, I just wanted to say about the right to disconnect. That's also something that lots of organisations might be thinking about. Are they making sure that they've got hybrid workers, home workers? Are they making sure they have some downtime? There's no legal right to disconnect in the UK. Other countries have implemented that. But again, it's maybe something that you might think about from a risk perspective and for that culture, well-being perspective. That's it that we had to cover today. Just got the next slide. Here's the proposed date for our next session, so the 16th of January. But your feedback would be really appreciated. So let us know if that date works. Let us know what you want to hear about. And we're delighted to conform. But thanks so much for joining us. And thanks very much for Yvonne from Hayes for sharing the insight from that survey, which I hope you all found helpful. And we hope to see you next time. So thank you again.
Thanks very much, everybody.